Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 41st Nation in Treaty 3 territory. On the panel with me today, joining via Zoom, is Mr. Kent Seelan and Ms. Linda Schultz. Our assessor today is Mr. Kem Wong, and our administrative person is Ms. Phoebe Graywood. My name is Bill Moretsky. I'm also on the panel and will be chairing this hearing. We will be hearing applications for revision of the assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that are made at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The Board of Revision is appointed annually by Council and is independent of it and the City Administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of King's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included with the board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I will confirm the points of appeal with your property to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We'll then have the assessor's testimony, followed by questions that the applicant may have, and then the applicant's testimony, followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all of the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You will receive the board's decision by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. We will be hearing items 1 to 8 on our docket today. Ms. Graywood, please affirm the assessor's and the applicant's testimony.
Mr. Wong, please state your full name.
Kem Wong.
Do you affirm the evidence you're about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. And Mr. Newman?
Mark Newman.
Do you affirm the evidence you're about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Okay, our first property on the docket today is 1861 Main Street. This is an application for revision of the assessed value. Mr. Wong, can you please begin your presentation?
Yes, thank you. The subject property is 1861 Main Street. The file number is 24-3866. The roll number is 1100009470000. The roll year is 2025, and the assessed value is $2,247,000. This is a residential apartment. It's 2 stories high, and it was built in 1960. It has 22 suites with 12 outdoor parking stalls. You can see on my page 1 that I'm recommending that the value be revised to $1,966,000, and we'll get to that on page 6. On page 3 is a picture of the subject property with its location, just on Main Street south of Kildonan Park Golf Course. On page 4 is our income valuation summary. We used average rents of $888 to get a potential income of $232,000. We used a 3% vacancy to get an effective gross income of $225,000. We used a 49% expense ratio to get a net operating income of $114,000. Kept at 5.1%, the estimated market value is $2,247,000, which is about $102,000 per unit. On page 5 are some rent comparables showing that the rents we've used are in line with what's in the market. On page 6 is a calculation of the revised value estimate. The model's effective gross income is 225,000, whereas their actual income is about 197,000. So it's a bit lower than what the model's estimated. So I've recalculated the value based off of their actual rent at 197,000, and I applied the model expense ratio at 49% to get a net operating income of 100,000, and applying the model cap rate of 5.1%. The revised value estimate is 1,966,000, which is about 89,000 per unit.
Okay, if I can just interrupt for a moment, please, Mr.
Sure.
Wong. Mr. Newman, do you accept that recommendation?
I would respond by saying it's a good start. I will want to ask Mr. Wong a couple of questions, but at this point, I think no, we should keep going.
Okay, please carry on, Mr. Wong.
Okay. On page 7 is information on how we derived our cap rates. With the majority of the cap rates falling between 4.7 and 5.45%, and with some falling lower than 4.75 and some falling higher than 5.45%. On page 8 are some cap rate sales that range from 3.46% to 5.74%. These cap rates, they were calculated stabilizing 3 years of income and expense information for the 3 years prior to the sale. And that was done for all of the sales on the chart. On page 10 is their income and expense statement for 2022. You can see their net operating income for the year is $60,000. The expenses for the subject property, they do appear to be normal, but I'm not sure if using all of their actual expenses would result in a very accurate estimate of value. If you did use the $60,000, it would result in and use the model cap rate of 5.1%. You get a value about 1.17 million, and that might work out to be a little bit over 53,000 a unit. Typically, properties, I don't believe I've seen any properties like this sell for 50,000 a unit. So using their actuals would result in, I feel, a inaccurately low estimate of value. If you go back to page 8, you can see that there's a couple properties on the top at Sargent that sold for 72,000 and 90,000 a unit. And you can see at 241 Yonge, it sold for 57,000 a unit. And 473 Burroughs for 86,000 a unit. Those typically, those are in a core area. And 677 Maryland sold for 75,000 a unit, also in a core area. But when you look outside the core area, such as at the bottom, 555 Corden, it sold for 98,000 a unit. And on Arden, it sold for 125,000 a unit, and on Bertrand, it sold for 102,000 a unit. So typically, from what I've seen, units outside the core areas are maybe 90 to 90,000 and up, maybe, and I've seen some in the 150,000 range. So the value that I've applied using their actual income and using the model expenses at 49%, it results in a value that is about 89,000 a unit. So feel that being at what I feel is the bottom end of the range for these types of units outside the core area, I feel it's a reasonable and fair value. And I ask that you accept the revised value at 1,966,000.
Thank you. Mr. Newman, do you have any question on the assessor's presentation?
I do, thank you. And first of all, good morning, Mr. Wong.
Morning, Mark.
So let's go to page 1 of your brief. And let me just say to the panel that, as is my practice, I may spend a few more minutes on this first one asking some questions. I won't repeat the questions as we go through each one in the interest of efficiency. So I'll just mention that. Page 1, so this building is 1960, as you've noted, both built and effective year built. So there's been no upgrades to this building that would change the effective year, correct?
I can't say that for sure. Sometimes there are upgrades that occur without the department knowing, so I can't say for sure.
Okay. Well, certainly no permits have come to the department's attention. Is that fair?
I don't believe so.
Okay. And so the building's about 65 years old as of today. Let me ask you a general question, and I'll say this in respect of all the properties. We've got 8 properties on the docket this morning. The first 4 are what I'm going to term smaller properties. The latter 4 are somewhat bigger. But in relative terms, properties become attractive in the marketplace, I'll suggest, for a number of different reasons. Would you agree that the older a property, potentially the shorter the lifespan, and therefore potentially there's greater risk with the property?
That could potentially be the case.
And similarly, would you agree that properties that have greater amenities, and I'll identify what I mean by that. Some properties, for example, will have underground or indoor parking. You've mentioned this property only has 12 stalls. So with 22 units, it actually doesn't even have a parking stall for each unit, correct?
It does not.
And so that in relative terms would be a negative for this property compared to properties that do have sufficient parking for each unit.
That could potentially be a negative, or it could potentially be a positive if you look at some apartment buildings that have no parking. So.
Sure, I agree. Having, let's call it a 50% ratio is better than a 0% ratio. I agree with that. There's no dishwashers, there's no air conditioning, there's no washers or dryers in these units, correct?
I'm not sure.
Well, if you look at the questionnaire that you've put at the back of your brief, page 11, I think you can see that the air conditioning box, central air, wall air, neither of those are checked off. So that tells us no air conditioning, correct?
That could be the case.
And similarly, right below that, in-suite appliances, fridge and stove is checked off, but dishwasher, washer, dryer is not checked off. So again, it tells us those appliances are not present, correct?
I would say probably not, but
Right.
I'm not 100% sure.
And would you agree with me that things like underground parking, things like dishwashers, things like washer and dryer in the unit, those are things that allow a unit to generate more revenue because people will pay more rent for those types of units?
That could potentially be the case.
All right. This property also has 22 units, as we've discussed. 3 are bachelor and 14 are 1 bedroom, and only 5 are 2 bedroom. Do you agree with me that generally a higher ratio of 2 bedroom units is better because, again, it allows a generation of higher revenue?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
Do you agree with me that buildings that have a higher proportion of two-bedroom units are more attractive because they allow the generation of higher revenue?
That's actually typically the case. Typically, two
Yes.
bedrooms achieve higher rents than one bedroom, so
Right.
the rents achieved from a two-bedroom would be higher.
Yes. All right. Okay. So you've explained to us that what you did in terms of the recommendation, and let's go to your page 6. I think you've explained to us that when you looked at the actual performance of the property, effectively what you did is you went to the effective gross income that the property generates, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, if we look at your page 10, the financial statement, we see the $197,196 as being the revenue total the property is generated after vacancy. And so that's why you've called it effective gross income, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so what you did, what you recognized by doing that is the rents the model was generating were too high.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. But you then stayed with the expense ratio the model generated of 49.16%. And again, still looking at your page 6, the end result of that was $96,942 of expenses.
Yes.
Correct? And you made comment while you gave your evidence that in looking at the expenses, they appeared to be normal. And you've only attached a single year's income statement, but you had access to years preceding that. And I gather you looked at those as well.
I don't recall.
Okay, fair enough. But so you allowed $96,000 of expenses, but if we look at page 10, we see the expenses were actually $131,000, correct?
Yes.
And expenses can vary from year to year a little bit. I recognize that. If a little bit more repair and maintenance is done in a given year, then the repair and maintenance will be a bit higher, and therefore the expenses will be a bit higher, correct?
Yes.
All right. So at the end of the day, you're using a net operating income of $100,000, and perhaps you don't recall whether the property has ever generated $100,000 of net operating income.
It's possible it might not have.
Right. Okay. So then let's turn to capitalization rate. The model's generated a 5.1% rate. You talked about page 8 of your brief, which is called capitalization rate evidence. And on this page, it says the following is a sample of actual sales that took place during the reference period. The purpose for showing these individual capitalization rates is to illustrate the accuracy of the model and substantiate model-derived rates. They are not meant to be comparable specific to the subject property. So to be clear, you're not saying that from this list of items on page 8, that's how you extract the capitalization rate for the subject property, correct?
Well, obviously, probably maybe not, because if you look at the cap rates that are on there of the maybe the lower income generating properties, the cap rates might be in the 3 and the 4% range, and in the subject's case, it's applied at 5.1. So
Right.
it might not be directly applied.
But again, my point is, because and the department puts this page in all of its apartment briefs, and the purpose, as it says, is to attempt to validate the accuracy of the model, correct?
It does or substantiate the accuracy of the model. It also gives a bit of an idea of what market value actually is.
Right. So And as well, in terms of capitalization rate, if you look at page 7 of your brief, those are the broker rates, and that's also the range of 20th and 80th percentiles by the city. But you'd agree with me that there's a range of capitalization rates that will apply to different properties, correct? In other words, not all apartment buildings are uniform. They're going to be impacted by their age, their condition, their unit mix, their amenities, their suite count, their availability of parking. All of those variables will come into play. Do we agree?
Yeah, I'm not sure if we have enough data to take all those, like say an apartment that has 10 parking stalls versus an apartment that has 20. I'm not sure if we have enough data to quantify any difference that makes.
Okay, fair enough. You agree that apartments are subject to rent control?
Typically.
And certainly older ones, you'd agree?
Typically, it depends on the situation. Every property is different. They can, if they are experiencing higher expenses, they could make a application to the RTB to increase their rents higher than the guideline.
But my point is, they're still subject to that rent control process. They can't do it on their own. The apartment industry, if I can call it that, is a regulated industry through residential tenancies, correct?
Like I say, typically, yes. Yeah.
All right. And do we agree that at April 1 of 2023, that was a time of higher interest rates and that the Bank of Canada interest rate had moved up significantly?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Okay, those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Schultz, any questions?
Just one, Mr. Assessor. I'm assuming that you have not visited this property or inspected the property inside other than the outside pictures?
Correct. I can't say for 100% certainty, but I don't believe I've inspected this property.
Yeah, thank you. That's all. Thank you.
Mr. Seelan, any questions?
Yes, the cap rate specifically for this property, is this model driven?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's all my questions, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. So 1861 Main Street then is outside of the core?
Yeah, it's by Kildonan Park Golf Course on Main Street.
Okay. And you mentioned that the expenses, you went to the actual expenses and got the effective gross income, but you also mentioned that the expenses look normal. I think that's what you said.
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Yeah.
But you decided to disregard that because it skewed your price per unit.
Yeah. Typically in valuation, we look at in valuation when they're trying to establish what operating income and what expenses to use, they might look at the normal operation of the property, and if maybe the appraiser or evaluator deems the expenses to be maybe a little bit outside the norm in terms of market, they might adjust those items to be more in line with market. And if their expenses are extremely high, then they may value based off of more market expense rates.
Yeah, but you said it was normal though, looked normal.
Well,
these expenses that they had, they said they looked normal.
Yeah, yes, they do. When you the reason why I didn't use them is because, like I said, if you use their actual expenses, it would result in a value of approximately maybe 53,000 per unit. And the thing is, I don't believe even when you look at the properties in the core, they're selling for maybe higher than that. And a typical apartments outside the core area, in my experience, they sell for maybe in the 90 to 150,000 range. And that's why I felt that applying the model expenses against their actual income, it reflects their actual income, but it also results in a value that is, I would say, reasonable and maybe a little bit on the lower end of the range.
Okay, so 241 on page 8, 241 Young was also built in 1960. Dollars per suite on that one is 58,000,
Yes.
quite a bit less than what you have. And it's also, yours is also built in 1960. So what would account for that?
I would say it's in more of a core area. If you look at the properties that are in the core area, like Sargent, Young, Burroughs, Maryland, they range from 57 to 90,000 per unit, and so if you look at the Young property on its own, it would appear that the revised value is on the high side. But when you look at it in conjunction with some of the other properties in the core, it's a little bit more, I would say, reasonable. And then when you look at properties outside the core, it looks, I would say, very reasonable. Because it's at the bottom end of the range for properties that are outside the core.
Okay. So is this kind of is on Main Street and it's across from the park, Kildonan Park, or not?
No,
Like it's
no, it's on
adjacent?
the same side of Main Street as Kildonan Park, just a little bit south of Kildonan Park.
So these cap rates on page 8, did you calculate what the average cap rate of your data is?
No, it just ranges from 3.46 to 5.74.
Okay.
Yeah, and typically, if you were to maybe use their actual expenses or their actual income, their low income, what I've seen typically done is that a much lower cap rate is used to try to value. But because we're using say, quote unquote, normal cap rate of 5.1%, I feel it's reasonable to use a slightly higher NOI, and maybe it's especially reasonable considering that the resulting value using that 5.1%, it results in a value that is at the high end of the range for core properties and at the low end of the range for outside the core properties.
Okay. Okay. I have no further questions then. Mr. Newman, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you. And so let me first of all express my appreciation to Mr. Wong, as he noted. What he did in terms of making the recommendation is essentially he looked at the performance of the property in 2022 and recognized that the model was reflecting rents that were higher than were achievable. And so he used the effective gross income that the property was actually generating. And that was originally one of the issues that I was raising. But since he's done that, that's no longer an issue. And really what we come down to ultimately is the expenses and the capitalization rate. So if we look at my brief, look at page 2. As we've noted, it's a 65-year-old property. If you go to page 2, top section of the page, sorry, page 3, top section of the page dealt with what the rents in place were. But as I say, that's now been addressed because, as you'll see when I get to my spreadsheet, Mr. Wong has essentially gone to the same effective gross income as I have, and he's actually taken it right off the statement. So that's no longer an issue. His calculation, however, uses $96,942. Let me just make sure I'm getting that right. Yes, $96,942 as his expenses. And as you can see, the expenses, and I've got 20, 21, and 22, and I've got the statements attached, so I'll show you those eventually as well. But the expenses are higher on this property. And reality is different properties operate in different ways. This is an older property, so it's not surprising that its expenses would be somewhat higher. Ultimately, I will show you the ratios, but I end up stabilizing at 54%. So now let's talk about the capitalization rate. And again, I'll spend a couple more minutes on this first one and then not spend as much time on the later ones. So obviously we get a range of capitalization rates. On page 4, there's a chart reflecting the reporting by the various brokers for the different categories of properties they report. This is a low-rise property. Colliers reports 5 to 6% at Q1 2023. CBRE is a little bit lower for what they call a low-rise A. I'll show you some definitions in a moment. I don't think this is a low-rise A. They show slightly higher for a low-rise B. Cushman shows for a low-rise higher at 5 to 5.75, and then the rest of them are high rises that the subject and the next few on the docket are not. So I'll skip past that for a moment. I asked the assessor about his knowledge of interest rates at April 1 of 2023, and he indicated he wasn't certain. So what I address on page 4 and page 5 is the significant increases in the Bank of Canada rate. And of course, we know that what your task is to determine a value at April 1 of 2023. Although debt service is not relevant for our purposes, reality is borrowing costs did go up significantly. You can see the chart on page 5 that shows the jump in the Bank of Canada rate in the 2 years between April 1 of 21 and April 1 of 23, from 0.25% up to 4.5%, so 425 basis points. And the reason that's important is because ultimately that impacts bond rates and borrowing rates, and that impacts capitalization rates, because the reality is that interest rates in many ways are the engine that drives the real estate economy. And that's why they're important, because they have an impact ultimately on capitalization rates. Page 8, I reference a number of criteria, and I asked Mr. Wong about these because I think that these are factors that influence capitalization rates, because not all buildings are the same and buildings have different characteristics. So, building type and construction, how's it constructed? This one is masonry block, so that's certainly better than wood frame, not heritage designated. Building amenities, no in-suite laundry, no balconies, no business spaces, no gyms, not enough parking stalls, 12 parking stalls. That's a problem. That makes a building less attractive in the marketplace. Yes, Mr. Wong is right. If a building has 0 parking stalls, then having 12 is better than 0. I agree with that. But when you don't have 1 parking stall for every unit in the building, that's potentially troublesome and will be limiting in terms of the pool of renters who may be attracted to the building. Durability of the income stream, the quality of the income stream, lower quality finishes and lower and fewer amenities, that can reduce the income stream. Age on page 9, the older the property, the shorter the remaining economic life. Functional obsolescence becomes an issue, greater capital expenditures potentially. Condition, this is an older dated building, and I can indicate I have not been in the building, to be clear. Parking, I've talked about that. The zoning bylaw in Winnipeg states you need 1.5 stalls per suite. This one clearly doesn't have that, but its age it would have preceded the zoning bylaw. So it's grandfathered. The suite mix, again, the more 2 bedrooms you have, the fewer bachelors, the fewer ones, your income potential is greater because 2s will always rent for more than 1s and bachelors. Number of suites, location, Mr. Wong is correct that this is just south of Kildonan Park. Indeed, it's almost immediately directly across the street from what used to be called Edmund Partridge Collegiate when I was growing up. Maybe it still is. You know, people do analysis and speak to capitalization rates. So we've talked about the brokers a little bit, and I will come back to that. Altus Group has also done a study and an analysis, and you can see a number of properties they've looked at on page 10 in their study, and you can see their indication of capitalization rates for buildings built between 1946 and 1969, putting it at 5.75 to 6.5. And let's be clear on something. The reason the brokers always express a range is because not all buildings are the same. Some buildings will sell at a 5.1 capitalization rate, but I'll suggest to you that older buildings with fewer amenities, with less parking stalls, are not going to be as attractive in the marketplace because the rent potential will be lower, and therefore they will sell for a higher capitalization rate. Page 12 is really a repetition, the heading categorization of buildings. That's really a repetition of what I said before. Page 13, rent control. So let's be crystal clear. All these buildings are under rent control. And rent control sets the limits on the rent increases that can be charged. You'll note that in 2020, it was 2.4%. In 21, it was 1.6%. And then in 22 and 23, it was 0%. Why was it 0%? Because the government decided that they were going to regulate this industry and they were going to diminish the increases that could be put in. And that's one of the difficulties with the apartment industry is it's a regulated industry. It's not truly an open market industry. And I'll suggest the fact that it's a regulated industry creates a greater level of risk than might be compared with other properties. So now I come to my conclusion. It's a dated building built in 1960. 77% of the units are bachelors or ones. Older style building onto page 14 without modern amenities, lesser quality. The net operating income revealed by the statements is, you can see it's 79,000, it's 60,000, it's 80,000. So it's never achieved the $100,000 amount that is being used under the recommendation. And so what I end up doing, and I think I've got a mistake here, and I'll just address that in a moment. Because it says capitalizing $100,386. And that's not my net operating income in my chart. I'm not actually sure how that number got there, but I'll show you my spreadsheet. So if we jump ahead to page 17, here's my spreadsheet. And as I say, my effective gross income was $197,456, essentially the same as Mr. Wong's at $197,196. So we're essentially the same. My expense ratio is higher at $106,000. And remember, I showed you the 3 years of expenses at $111,000, $131,000, and $130,000. And ultimately, you can see I'm using a net operating income of $90,829. I'm not using $60,000, and I'm using a 5.75% capitalization rate, and that results in a value of $1,580,000 rounded. Let me then just show you the statements. So page 18, this property has a March year end, so this statement is actually at March of 2023. It's right up to the reference date. And you can see that at March of 2023, the net operating income was $79,740. And you can see the expenses were $130,000. If you go to page 22, that's actually where Mr. Wong took his gross potential income from. He took it from that page. And you can see that the expenses were somewhat higher in that year. And so we end up with a $60,000 NOI. And then you can see on page 23, we end up with an $80,000 NOI. And so again, what I've done is I brought the expense ratio up, and let's go back now to my spreadsheet on page 17. I brought the expense ratio up to 54%, and I've taken $90,000 of net operating income, capitalized at 5.75%, and that's $1,580,000 rounded. That's my submission. I'm open to questions.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wong, any questions on the applicant's presentation?
Yes, just on page 14.
Yes,
I guess you're requesting a value of about $1,580,000.
that's correct.
That works out to maybe about 71,000 a unit.
That's correct.
It's on page 10 on the cap rate sales. Would you say that the 345 Talbot and 738 St. Mary's would be most similar to the subject property in terms of age?
Yes.
And I guess 335 is indicating 91,000 per unit, and 738 is indicating 112,000 per unit. And
Yes,
you're
but
seeking 71,000 a unit. Would that concern you about the approach that you've taken to try to value the property, the subject property?
no, because as the note indicates in relation to 738 St. Mary's, for example, the building has been upgraded in 2018. That's the difficulty. You know, one has to be aware of the condition and the upgrades that may have occurred, and which then allow a greater level of revenue to be generated.
Okay. And on, I guess, page 11 and maybe some of the pages prior, some of the considerations that you would take in terms of making adjustments to the cap rate with regards to building type, age, condition, location. Looking at the sales on page 10, like on 345 Talbot and 677 St. Mary's, wouldn't it be safe to say that those properties would encompass all those the negative aspects that might be considered in a cap rate analysis, and no maybe further adjustments would be necessary to account for such negative aspects?
So just so I'm clear, because you said 677 St. Mary's, do you
Oh,
mean?
sorry, 677 Maryland.
Right, okay. So, 677 Maryland, as a property, it's noted that there's been an ongoing decline in prices. And that's a 1913 building initially, with an updated effective year built in 1972. So again, how the build.
Sorry, my apologies. I actually meant 345 Talbot and 738 St. Mary's, which are similar in age to the subject property. Sorry.
Okay, all right. So again, yes, some of the locational and other factors will be taken into account. But again, it's frequently a factor of the condition of the property, the extent to which it's been upgraded. And as it's noted, 738 St. Mary's has been upgraded. And so it's going to have the ability to generate and will generate higher rents. the subject is not an upgraded property.
Okay. I just want to say, typically speaking, wouldn't 345 Talbot and 738 St. Mary's include some of the negative aspects that are mentioned, and therefore maybe no further adjustments would be necessary?
Not if again, in the case of St. Mary's, upgrades will enhance the revenue generating capacity, and it will lead to a different value.
Okay. That would be all my questions.
Mr. Steelan, any questions for the
Yes.
applicant?
Have there been any renovations or upgrades to this particular location?
My advice, and I expressly asked of the property manager who's had this property under their management for many, many, many years, it's Ash Management. And my advice is there have not been upgrades to this property.
Thank you. That's all. Any questions, Mr. Chair?
Ms. Schultz, any questions?
Asked and answered. Thank you. No further.
And I have no questions. Anything in summation, Mr. Wong?
Yes, just that the revised value that I've recommended is in line with actual market value, and I feel it's at the lower end of the range for, like I said, properties outside the core. So I feel it's a fair and reasonable estimate of value, even though it doesn't reflect their actual expenses. And I ask that you accept the revised value of $1,966,000.
Thank you. Mr. Newman, anything in summation?
Yeah, just very briefly in response to Mr. Wong's last comment. We're doing the income approach here. We're not doing a direct comparison approach, which of course is a very different approach. As he said, the expenses appear normal. And again, I've not taken the net operating income down as low as it actually has been at $90,000. It's above what's actually been achieved on the property. And so I think our submission is reasonable. Thank you.
Thank you. That will conclude property 1861 Main Street. Proceed to the next property on the docket, 1880 Main Street. This is an application for revision of the amount of assessed value. Mr. Wong, can you please begin your presentation?
Yes, thank you. The subject property is 1880 Main Street. The file number is 24-3865. The roll number is 110-300-31000. The roll year is 2025, and the assessed value is $3,787,000. This is a residential apartment. It's 2 stories high, and it was built in 1959. It has 40 units with 22 outdoor parking stalls. On page 3 is a picture of the subject property with its location, similar to the previous property. It's located on Main Street, just south of Kildonan Park. On page 4 is our income valuation summary. We used average rents of $899 to get a potential income of $431,000. We used a 3% vacancy to get an effective gross income of $418,000. And we use a 52% expense ratio to get a net operating income of $200,000. I capped at 5.3%. We have an estimated market value of $3,787,000, which is about $94,000 per unit. On page 5 are our rent comparables, showing that the rents we've used are in line with what's in the market. On page 6 and 7 is information on how we derived our cap rates and some cap rate sales that range from 3.46 to 5.74%. On page 9 is the income statement supplied by the owner. Let's see. Their estimated net operating income for 2022 is about $211,000, and that's about 11,000 higher than what the model is estimated at 200,000. In this particular case, the model's net operating income at about 201,000 is supported by the actual income, which might be about 211,000, maybe about 10,000 higher. And if the model cap rate that's been applied is substantiated by market sales, and the overall value at 94,000 per unit is reasonable, and it's probably at the lower end of the range for properties outside the core area. So they feel that the assessed value is supported, and I ask that you maintain the assessed value at 3,787,000.
Thank you. Mr. Newman, any questions for the assessor?
Yes. So again, your brief, Mr. Wong, at pages 9 and 10 has the single year financial statement of 2022 attached. Did you look at the prior years?
I am not sure.
Okay. If you look at page 9, and this is a 40-unit building, correct?
Yes.
So if you look at page 9, and so not only is it a 40-unit building, it's also built in 1959. And on your page 1, that appears to be the effective age as well. And to be clear, this building is essentially across the street from the last building we did, correct?
I believe so.
Yeah. So it's a 66-year-old building. Mr. Wong, you look at a lot of apartment buildings. You look at a lot of statements. Unless I'm mistaken, I think maybe the only property type you do is apartments. I'm not certain, but I'm asking.
Yes.
Okay. So you look at a lot of statements. Do you understand that frequently appraisers and other valuators will have a metric, which is, cost per unit for various types of expenses?
They could potentially have that to
And-
have a market a number for such items.
Yeah, and just, hypothetically, somebody might say that your utilities should cost you $300 a unit. That's a metric they can look at, correct?
Potentially. I'm not sure. I actually have not spoken with appraisers with that regard. It's just
Okay.
from my own experience.
Right. All right. Fair enough. So if you look at page 9, your repair and maintenance is $36,421. And if you look at that on a per unit basis, that's $910 per door. And I'm going to suggest to you that that's a very low amount for a building that is 66 years old. Do you accept that?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if, in my experience, the typical range might be about, say, maybe 500 to about 1750 on a normal basis. So that 900 seems to it falls in the range. If you were to adjust that number up a bit, I probably wouldn't fault you for it. But
Right.
if you were to accept the
Okay.
number as is, I wouldn't fault you for that either.
So, and let me say to you that I don't know what apartment building can operate with expenses for repair and maintenance of only 500 a door, but leave that aside. That's why I asked if you looked at the prior statements to see what the repair and maintenance was like for them, but I don't think you're in a position to address that, so I'll leave that alone. I think those are my questions. Thank you.
Good. Mr. Phelan, any questions?
No
The
questions
assessor.
here. Thank you.
Ms. Schultz, any questions?
No questions at this time, thank you.
I have no questions.
So,
You wanted to say something more about the assessor's presentation?
no,
Mr. Newman?
no, I was ready to proceed if you're ready
Okay.
for me.
Yes, you can proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me cut to the heart of this. Let's jump ahead to page 16. And you can see on my page 16, which is my spreadsheet, that the difference between the parties is essentially, it's two things, of course. It's the net operating income and it's the capitalization rate. But on this one, unlike on the prior one, Mr. Wong did not go to the actual effective gross income. Rather, he stayed with the model, and his model suggested $431,928 of gross potential income, less 3%, which is $418,970 of effective gross. It then applied a 52.09% expense ratio, and that got it to $200,729. And Mr. Wong says, in part, when you look at the 2022 statement, the actual net income is $211,000. So he says, essentially, but nicely, to be clear, I'm not throwing stones at Mr. Wong. I'm saying this with a smile, but he says to me nicely, essentially, stop complaining. My NOI is less than actual. And I understand that, but there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is that's why you have to look at multiple years of financial statements, which is something I've done. So if you jump ahead to page 20, that's the 2022 financial statement, as Mr. Wong has it in his brief. And you can see that I've circled the $396,000. Like 1861 Maine, this would essentially be the effective gross income. Then you see the expenses. The expense ratio is 46.7%, and you end up with an NOI of $211,000. But let's look at page 21. There's the 2021 expenses. And now you see expenses of $231,000. In particular, look at the maintenance and repair, which is $84,000 compared to the prior year, which is $36,000. And now we've got a very different net operating income of $152,000. And then look at the 2020 statement, and you've got an expense ratio of 56.58%, and you've got a net income, an operating income of $164,000. And the point I'm making to you through all this, of course, is there is variance in expenses from year to year. It's important to look at multiple years. And so if we come back now into my brief, what I did on my valuation is my starting point was different. I took the actual rents in place as my starting point. So I am on my page 2 now. And that creates potential income of $383,000 compared to the assessor's $431,000. On to page 3, I reference the expense ratio. I show you what the expense ratios were in 22, 21, and 20. The average expense ratio is 54.43%, but I say to you, conditional on the use of the appropriate gross potential income and an adjustment to the capitalization rate, I'll accept the assessor's 52.09%. So that brings us back to the capitalization rate. This building is truly right across the street from the other building. And it's right beside Edmund Partridge Collegiate, actually, to the north side of it. It's a 66-year-old building. Again, same circumstance, no amenities, no dishwasher, no air conditioning, none of any of that. It's a dated building. And so the question becomes, where does it fit into the spectrum of buildings? And I say it fits into the spectrum of buildings at a higher capitalization rate than 5.3%. And it's interesting that these two buildings directly across the street from each other, and I observe and I note that one has 22 units and one has 40 units. So clearly there's a size difference. There's 1 year difference in age, 1959 as opposed to 1960. I can't imagine that's that important. But there is a size difference clearly. And the expense ratio on one is 49.16%, and on the other it's 52.09%. And that's why site-specific becomes important, and models, they're good as a starting point, but I'll suggest they're not so good as a finishing point because of the variability of buildings, and what's actually happening in them. So in terms of my cap rate section, and I'm not going to repeat what I addressed with you previously, you've got the broker cap rates and the ranges on page 3. You've got the increased cost of borrowing and higher interest rates, as I spoke to you on the last one. At page 7 and 8, you've got all those variables that can impact properties. At page 10, you've got the Altus analysis and their commentary about buildings built in the 1946 to 1969 timeframe, range of 5.75 to 6.5. If you jump ahead, page 12, you've got the rent control reference I had in the previous brief. Again, just highlighting some of the greater difficulty. And then if you look at page 13, here's really my conclusions. Dated building, 92% of the units are either bachelor or one-bedroom units. So again, the upside potential of 2-bedroom units and the higher revenue they can generate is diminished. Older style building without modern amenities, and again, on the scale of quality, it's a lesser quality and should be at the higher end of the capitalization rate range. The assessor's NOI of $200,729 achieved only once in 3 years, and achieved in that year because repair and maintenance at $36,421 were at their lowest level in those 3 years. So what I do is I use the rents in place, I accept the assessor's expense ratio, and that gives me a net operating income of $183,048. So that's a decision point for you. And then I capitalize at 5.75%, again, based on the age and quality and condition of the building. And I get to a value of $3,183,000. You see that on my page 16 in the form of the spreadsheet. And I've already been through the attached income statements for the property. So that's where I'm coming from. That's my submission. Open for questions.
Thank you. Mr. Wong, any questions on the applicant's presentation, please?
No questions.
Ms. Schultz, any questions?
Just one question. Have you seen the inside or anything of this apartment?
I have not.
Okay. I know you had some history of the other apartment as far as the people that owned it. Anything on this one?
Well, again, it's exactly the same property manager.
Okay.
And again, these buildings are directly across the street from each other.
Okay, thank you.
And indeed, I'll say to you now that the first 5 properties on the docket are all run by Ash Management as property manager.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Seelan, any questions?
Yes, has there been any renovations to this property?
There have not.
Thank you. That's all my questions, Mr. Chair.
Page 2. You said that you used the rents in place to get your potential income. Now, did you do these rents in place include parking?
So they do not.
So there would actually be some revenue from parking, would there?
There would be, yes.
And if we go to income statements that's provided.
Yeah, if you go to page 20.
Yeah, I guess my question is those residential parking amounts are actually fairly significant. Might change your potential income if you use that.
It would somewhat, yes, but keep in mind that I went with a lower expense ratio, but absolutely, it would have some impact.
So also on page 20, the repair and maintenance issue, 36,000 in 22, and then the previous 2 years was about double each time. Would that be correct characterization?
Yes, it would average double. That's correct.
That's also pretty significant. Could that, yeah, how do I frame this question? Maintenance and let's just maybe ask a little bit about what this maintenance repair actually is. Could you just briefly describe to me what that is or what that would include?
Yeah, so it can obviously include a spectrum of different things. But reality is older buildings like this, frequently there can be a significant component in a boiler, for example, that might go, and suddenly you're working on the boiler itself, but you've also got to work on the lines that distribute the hot water through the building. Things like that arise. I'm not saying every year, but they arise with regularity. You can have significant roof leaks on dated buildings. Again, there's a whole spectrum of items of that type, and that's why you get often significant variability in the R&M from year to year. And additionally, owners make decisions. I'm going to defer a cost for a year. I need some money. I want to generate some more money, so I'll defer something for another year, and you get a lower year of maintenance and repair, and that's why it's important to look at multiple years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I'm wondering if maybe the previous 2 years were years that are actually anomalies, right? There were this maintenance repair. They just decided to do some work in those 2 years. Is that possible?
So certainly it's possible. I don't disagree with that. But the reality is, in my experience and from talking to appraisers, they will say to you that on an older building like this, it's common to have annual expenses on a per unit door basis of in the $1,400, $1,500, $1,600 range.
Okay. And this one is how much?
Well, depending on which year you use, if you take $1,600 on 40 units, then you get to $64,000.
Okay. Okay, no further questions. Mr. Wong, anything in summation?
No, thank you.
Mr. Newman, anything in summation?
Not really. I'll just, apropos of your last question to me, Mr. Moretsky, if you take the R&M over the 3 years and average it, it averages out to about $61,000 a year, which would be just under $1,600 a door. And beyond that, I think you have my points in position. Thank you.
Oh, understood. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, that will conclude this property, 1880 Main Street. So I think we'll try to do one more property before a break, if possible. If everybody can hang in there.
One more is good.
Okay. 437. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, if anybody else needs a break, that's fine too.
Yeah. No, we'll I think everybody's okay with one more property. So I didn't hear any objections. 437 Marion. This is an application for revision of the amount of the assessed value. Mr. Wong, if you please proceed with your presentation.
Yes, thank you. The subject property is 437 Marion Street. The file number is 24-3837. The roll number is 060-813-31000. The roll year is 2025, and the assessed value is $819,000. This is a residential apartment. It's 2 stories high. It was built in 1952, and it has 9 suites with 5 outdoor parking stalls. On page 2 is the sale history for the subject property. It sold in in 2015 for $779,000. On page 3 is a picture of the subject property with its location. On page 4 is our income valuation summary. We used average rents of $761 to get a potential income of $82,000. We used a 2.6% vacancy to get an effective gross income of $80,000. And we used a 50% expense ratio to get a net operating income of $39,000. Capped at 4.8%, we have an estimated market value of $819,000 or about 100 or 91,000 per unit. On page 5 are some rent comparables showing that the rents we've used are in line with what's in the market. On page 6 and 7 is information on how we derived our cap rates, along with some cap rate sales that range from 3.46 to 5.74%. On page 9 is the income statements supplied by the owner. The remainder of my brief is the income statement from 2021 and 2020. In their income statement, they do include mortgage expense, which wouldn't be included in calculating their normal operating income. But if you remove that mortgage expense, their net operating income for 2022, 2021, and 2020 are $27,000 for 22, $46,000 for 21, and $41,000 for 2020. This supports the model's net operating income of about $39,000.
Can you repeat those numbers again, please?
Sure. Their net operating income when you exclude the mortgage for 2022 is $27,000, $46,000 for 2021, and $41,000 for 2020.
Thank you.
So that's in line with what the model is estimated at $39,000. And when you combine that with the property selling for $779,000, I believe that supports the model's estimated $819,000. So I ask you maintain the assessed value at $819,000.
Thank you. Mr. Newman, any questions on the assessor's presentation?
Yes, a couple. If we look to page 6, again, that's your cap rate chart. And the 20th percentile, the 80th percentile that the city has in concept, the 20th percentile represents the better buildings, the 20% of the best buildings. Is that fair?
I'm not sure if that's not maybe in my experience. Normally the cap rates are in the 3 and 4%, in the lower below 4%. They're typically some of the poorer properties that have lower NOI, lower incomes and lower NOIs. So I'm not sure if you can say that the lower the cap rate, the lower the risk. It's just the cap rate in this case is just a calculation in terms of their net operating income relative to the sale price.
No, I understand the math of how you calculate a cap rate. So what does 4.75% as the 20th percentile mean from your perspective?
It means that it's the lowest 20th percentile.
And is that not a reflection of the best buildings?
I'm not sure if it's just a reflection of that portion of cap rate. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the best building because, like in my experience, the buildings with the lower cap rates are the ones are typically the ones with lower incomes, and that's how you get cap rates that are that low. It's not an indication that they are the best properties. I'm not sure what your experience is, but that's my experience.
Okay, well, I've always understood that the 20th and 80th percentiles on all the different types of properties is intended to be a reflection statistically of the distribution of the capitalization rates in the city study. And the 20th percentile is intended to reflect the best 20%. It's the number that represents the point for the best 20% of the properties.
I don't know if it's the best 20%. I'm just saying I think it's more accurate that it represents the lowest 20% and not necessarily an indication that it is the nicest, best property.
Well, lowest capitalization rates typically come with the best properties, don't they?
Not that I've seen. And I don't know. You said you've talked to appraisers, but in my view of some of the appraisals, properties that are at the lower income generating, they might value them with cap rates that are pretty low. So like I said, I'm not sure what your experience is, but that's my experience where it's not necessarily a 3.5 cap is the best property, it's the nicest property. It's more along the lines of it's just the NOI against the sale price.
Okay. So we're getting into a very interesting area, and I'll speak to it more in my submission. So 1952, the building's 73 years old, correct?
Yes.
And it's only 9 units. And so when you've got only 9 units, if you have a unit that goes vacant for a month or two, that creates a significant vacancy, doesn't it?
Potentially.
And if you have a repair, if you have to replace a boiler, for example, you've got only 9 units to spread that cost over, or you've got the revenue from only 9 units to spread that cost over. So that means there's a significant impairment of the cash flow on the property, correct?
Yeah, it's a possibility in terms of how much it might affect the value. It
Right.
doesn't appear to affect the value that much in terms of smaller buildings.
And the 4.8% is certainly below the range reported by any of the brokers, isn't it?
It is different from the brokers, but you know what? I'm not sure what sales the brokers are using, but the sales that we're using, as indicated on page 7 on our cap rate chart, it does indicate cap rates that are lower than what the brokers are reporting.
Yeah, and again, we're getting into that interesting area that I'll speak to. Okay, those are my questions.
Ms. Schultz, any questions?
No
The
question,
assessor?
no questions at this time. Thank you.
Mr. Seelan, any questions?
My questions have been asked and answered. Thank you.
So you've got a 1952 building. That's the oldest one that we've seen on the prop so far. And a cap rate of 4.8. So the age of the property hasn't been a factor in the calculation of the cap rate. Would that be a correct assumption?
I'm not totally sure, but like a cap rate in the 4s for a smaller building such as this, it does seem to be consistent with some of the sales that I've seen, and I don't know why, but my guess would be that typically smaller buildings are have a larger pool of potential buyers and might produce a result in a lower cap rate.
Right. No further questions. Mr. Newman, can you please
Thank you.
begin your presentation?
Yes, so we are accepting the net operating income in this case, as the assessor noted, and as we noted on page 2. When you look at the array of net operating incomes over the 3 years, the average was $38,135, and therefore we accept the assessor's net operating income. The issue becomes the capitalization rate, and now we get into a little bit of an interesting discussion beyond what I've already spoken to you about capitalization rates. So the concept of some of these smaller buildings generating low cap rates, we need to be crystal clear on something about how the city calculates their capitalization rates. They don't use actual revenues. They don't use actual expenses. They do use the actual sale price, but they don't use an actual net operating income. What they do is their capitalization rates are driven by model rents, model expenses, which gets you to what I'll call a model net operating income. And then the city uses the sale price, and from that, they extract a capitalization rate. And that's the difficulty with what they've done. And I'm going to read you something from page 6 of the assessor's brief. For the 2025 general assessment, capitalization rates were derived from model-generated estimates of net operating income and sale prices that were time adjusted. The assessed values produced by the application of these model-generated capitalization rates were compared to sales prices, and assessment to sale price ratios were calculated. So the point I'm making to you is that, and I know this is the city's methodology, and it's been that way for years, and depending on the case, we end up having a great debate about it or not very much debate about it. But Mr. Wong has sort of alluded to it a little bit, and pointing to the fact that capitalization rates seem to be low on a lot of these buildings. And I must say, when you look at the buildings listed on his page 8, you know, a lot of these buildings are small, they're old, they're not in the best areas, and yet they seem to generate these very low capitalization rates. And you scratch your head and you say, why would anybody who has an option at April 1 of 2023 to buy a GIC that will give them 5.5%, why would somebody buy an 8-unit building on Sargent at a 3.46% capitalization rate? Why would anybody do that? What's the upside in a building on 727 Sargent that would cause somebody to do that? And the answer is that I think the capitalization rate, because it's model generated, has to be viewed with some suspicion and some concern. Now let's put that aside. So you have all been sitting on panels and hearings for a long time. You're all experienced. And I've said this to prior panels, and Mr. Wong's experienced, and I'm experienced. We all have a sense of where things fit in the spectrum of properties. And I'll say to you simply, the best properties, the best condition, the greatest number of amenities, that has the greatest upside rent potential for future upside rent generation. Those are the properties that are more in demand. Those are the properties that reflect the lower capitalization rates because of those qualities. Properties that are dated, properties that don't have amenities, properties that are small, they bring a lower capitalization rate because they are riskier. And so here we have a 9-unit building. And as I asked of Mr. Wong, and Mr. Wong's very careful in his answers, I understand and appreciate that. But look, I think we all understand if you have a unit that goes vacant for a couple of months, when it's one of 9, that's in theory 11%. It's very easy to generate a vacancy in a building like that. If you have a circumstance where you have a boiler that needs to be done, an expense like that can be really expensive and can have a significant impact on the economics of the building. Same thing when you need to replace a roof. So I just say to you that these buildings are higher risk. And I say to you at the end of the day, that a 4.8% capitalization rate for a building of this age, of this size, of this condition does not make sense. Let's jump to page 13 of my brief. Page 13 of my brief is some of the definitions that the brokers contain and provide with respect to their rankings. And so here's at the top of 13, Cushman Wakefield. They categorize a low-rise building as anything having fewer than 80 units. And they say the range is 5% to 5.75%. So does it make sense to you that a building that's got 80 units is going to have less risk associated with it in terms of the impact of vacancy or repair compared with a building that's 9 units? So there's a range they generate. Doesn't it make sense to you that a building like the subject is going to be at the higher end of that range rather than the lower end of that range? Lower section of page 13. CBRE. They've got low rise, 4 stories and below in height. They've got Class A and they've got Class B. And they say Class B are properties which offer functional space with rental rates near to or below the market average. And they report a rate of 5 to 5.25%. So I say to you simply that I think the capitalization rate on this building should be higher. I end up selecting 5.75%. If you look at the bottom of my page 14, there's no spreadsheet on this one. If you look at the bottom of my page 14, I've accepted the assessor's net operating income. I'm applying a capitalization rate of 5.75%. That turns into $683,982, $684,000 of value. That's my submission. I'm open to questions.
Thank you. Mr. Seelan, any questions? Oh, sorry, the assessor. Yeah, Mr. Wong. Sorry.
No questions.
Mr. Seelan?
No questions, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Ms. Schultz?
No questions, thank you.
For these smaller, older properties at lower cap rates, you said you asked the question, why would anybody buy that? Because they can get a GIC, same amount, even better. Are properties like this going up in price?
Well, that's the argument, of course, that's why people buy real estate. They buy it for 2 reasons. They buy it because they can get a yield on it, and they buy it because the hope is that over time it will appreciate. The difficulty is that coming out of COVID, there have been restrictions imposed by government on rent. There's all sorts of things the government is trying to do to address affordable housing and limiting what landlords can charge. But the other thing that's become very significant for landlords is their costs. Repair and maintenance has gone through the roof. Materials have become more expensive. Trades have become more expensive. It's really become very much different from an expense perspective in that regard than it used to be historically. So yes, people are optimists always. The market is always optimistic. The market believes that things will continue to go up, and over a long enough period of time, they do. But in the short term, I think buying a small property of this type brings with it significant risk. And to be clear, the GIC reference I was making was in comparison to the 3.46 capitalization rate, which was the building on Sargent on the assessor's list of cap rate sales. And there I was saying that's why I'm concerned about those capitalization rates, because they're model driven net operating income. They're not actual net operating income. And that's where I was saying, why would anybody buy a property like this when at April 1 of 23, they could get a GIC at 5.5% and take the risk of a small little property like this? That's what I was saying.
Great. Just on the last thing you said there, you said that the cap rates that you pointed, or sorry, you referenced the one that the assessor had on 727 Sargent, 3.46.
Yes.
And then you said that they were model driven, based on model driven information. Is that what you said?
That's what I said, yes.
Because at the top of his page there, it says that it's been developed through stabilizing owner-operated income and expense information.
Sure, that's what it says. But again, if you come back to their cap rate chart on page 6, they explain there, and that's what I read to you, that their capitalization rates are derived from model-generated estimates of net operating income.
That chart, yeah, but the one on page 7 is based on actual information. That be correct?
Well, sure. That's what it says. Stabilized, and I don't know how stabilized. And again, you know, if you've got $800 or $900 or $1 million to invest, are you buying a building on 727 Sargent at a 3.46 cap rate? It's you know, maybe. Would a prudent investor do that? In my view, no, but I guess there's always somebody out there who will buy something.
Okay, no further questions. Anything in summation, Mr. Wong?
Yeah, just that I mean, within the income approach, you can have probably very wildly or greatly varying approaches, and so you can have like 5 different income approaches that result in greatly maybe differences in value estimates. So I don't necessarily disagree with the approach that the applicant has taken in terms of trying to value this property. But what I will say is that maybe the approach that we've taken, or the approach that the model has utilized, has resulted in an estimate of value of say 819,000, and that's just a little bit higher than what the property sold for in 2015. So I think, you know, I don't disagree with the approach that the applicant has taken, but I think in this particular instance, and maybe the other instances that on the previous properties, that the approach that we've taken has resulted in a fairly reasonable and accurate estimate of value. And with regards to suspicions about the cap rates that the department has utilized, maybe you can be suspicious, but like when you use the cap rates that the model has estimated, or and you try to estimate values using those model cap rates, they result in a accurate estimate of value, and that's what our modelers do. They compare the modeled values against actual sales, and they're pretty close from a statistic standpoint. So it's not like these cap rates are just made up to be low or whatever they might be. The truth is, when you use these cap rates to try to estimate the values of properties, they result in accurate estimates of value, as it's been statistically shown from our modelers. So I mean, that leads me to sort of say that you know, someone can be suspicious of those cap rates, but like in my view, and it just sort of seems like they do result in accurate estimates of value, and they are fairly reasonable. And so for this in this particular case, the 819,000 appears to be reasonable, slightly on the lower end of the range, and in line with what it sold for in 2015 for 779,000.
Thank you. Mr. Newman, anything in summation?
I think you have my points. Thank you.
Okay. That then will conclude that property 437 Marion Street. So we will go for a recess now, return at 10:55, please.
Thank you.
20 minutes?
Seems a little bit long. I don't know if that seems
10:45, yeah, good catch.
okay. Maybe we're gonna grab a bite or something, but no, 10:45 sounds good.
Thank you.
Okay, we are back to order. Our next property is 355 St. Anne's Road. This is an application for revision of the amount of the assessed value. Mr. Wong, can you please begin your presentation?
Yes, thank you. The subject property is 355 St. Anne's Road. The file number is 24-3833. The roll number is 080-027-50000. The roll year is 2025, and the assessed value is 2,680,000. This is a residential apartment that's 2 stories high. It was built in 1963 and has 29 suites with 16 outdoor parking stalls. On page 2 is the sales history for the subject property. Like they're all dollar sales, but the sworn value in 2013 was 2,000,004, and the sworn value in 2021 is 2,750,000. On page 3 is a picture of the subject property with its location. On page 4 are some interior pictures from the manager's website. On page 5 is our income valuation summary. We used average rents of $837 to get a potential income of $291,000. We used a 3.6% vacancy to get an effective gross income of $281,000. And we used a 50% expense ratio to get a net operating income of $138,000. Capped at 5.15%, the estimated market value is $2,680,000, which is about $92,000 per unit. On page 6 are some rent comparables showing the rents we've used are in line with what's in the market. On page 7 and 8 is information on how we derived our cap rates and some cap rate sales that range from 3.46 to 5.74%. The remainder of my brief is the income statement supplied by the owner. You can see on page 10, their income was $260,000 for 2022. And on page 12, their income is about $253,000. Sorry. Their net operating income for the 3 years is $106,000, $116,000, and $111,000 for 2000. It's a little bit lower than what the model is estimated at, or noticeably lower than what the model is estimated at 138,000. But it does appear that the property is being improved. And so I've looked at this from a more market perspective, in the sense that the model rents that have been applied, they're supported by the market, and by market rent comparables. The model expenses at 50% is in line with the market, and is reasonable for it appears to be a well-maintained building. And regarding the cap rate is supported by some market sales, and once again, their actual NOI is lower than what the model is estimated. But when you look at the overall value at 92,000 per unit, it is reasonable, and it is at the lower end of the range compared to other market sales. Also, when you look at the sworn values for the two sales that exist, it supports the assessed value at 2,680,000. So I ask that you maintain the assessed value at 2,680,000.
Thank you. Mr. Newman, any questions on the assessor's presentation?
Yes, I'll have a few. Let's go to page 10. So as you've noted, the revenue is 260,000, and that's the equivalent of effective gross income, correct?
Yes.
And the model says the effective gross income is $281,000, correct?
Yes.
And the model says the net operating income is 138,000 and change, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So, and page 10, the financial statement tells us that the net operating income in that year was $106,000, as you've noted. In this one, you've also attached the financial statements for prior years. If we go to your page 12, there's the net operating income of $116,000 in 2021. And if we go to your page 13, there's the net operating income for 2020 at 111,000 and change. So at the end of the day, that's obviously one of the places we're apart, is the net operating income. And the model says 138, and actual performance on the property is in the range at the high end of, say, 116,000, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, this property, you noted, has 16 stalls for 29 units. So certainly it doesn't have sufficient parking for each and every unit, correct?
I'm not sure if you or I can make a call on how sufficient it is. We can only state that it has 16 stalls for the property.
Okay. And again, here we have a capitalization rate of 5.15%. You made reference to sales. Did you investigate those transactions in any way?
The ones on page 2, I did not.
Are you aware that none of those were actual sales to third parties?
You can see the consideration is like $1, so that would indicate that.
Yes. Okay. Those are my questions. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Mr. Seelan?
So this was all model driven.
I believe so, yes.
Why would the NOI be so different with respect to the actuals?
Because I guess the NOI is model derived, and so the model doesn't look at the actual income statements for that property. Like there's a lot of times where we don't have anything. So what it does look at is it sort of combines all the income and expense information from all the properties that have submitted information, and it sort of estimates what the income and expenses would be. And in this case, it is estimating something a little bit higher than what they're actually getting. But like I said, when you look at the overall value, it does appear to be reasonable, and it is a little bit in line with the sworn values that are indicated.
Okay, thank you. That's all my questions, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Schultz, any questions?
Just one, have you inspected this property or seen the inside, other than the pictures? Those you said were from the management
Yeah, the managers. I don't
photos?
believe I've inspected this property.
Okay. No further questions. Thank you.
Okay, just I want to carry on with the previous question about the actual income versus the model generated income.
Yes.
So why are they, the question was, why are they far apart? Well, one was model driven and one was actual.
Yes.
In your opinion, which one is more accurate? Is it the actual or is it the model?
I believe maybe, in my opinion, it's somewhere in between what the actuals are and what the model is. It's just because, like, I guess for typically in my experience with valuation, they don't always go off of their actuals. And if market, say income, or if market expenses are a better indicator of market value, then the valuator might utilize those market numbers. They might instead of their actuals. So in this particular case, I feel it's somewhere in between, where in terms of the model and the actuals. But when you look at the overall model value, it does appear to be reasonable when it's coming in. It's at about 92,000 a unit, and the property, the location near the St. Anne's Road, it's a fairly strong rental area, and so to have, I guess, to value this property at 92,000 a unit is, in my view, it's fair and reasonable. And even though it seems to be overestimating the net operating income a little bit as compared to the actuals, I feel it is a fair and reasonable value, just based off of some of the sales that might be indicated on my page 8 with some of the cap rate sales.
So would this be a correct characterization of the way you're looking at the properties, not just this property, but the properties today? You're putting the majority of your emphasis or weight, if you will, on the dollars per suite. Would that be correct?
I would say that's reasonable, because, like, in the end, we're trying to best estimate market value, and if the truest indicator of market value, the actual sales of properties are supporting a value that is maybe a little bit higher than what their actual income is supporting, then I might be inclined to lean down that road. And because, I mean, like I said, within the income approach, you can look at it in multiple different ways in terms of income or expenses, or a low cap rate or a high cap rate. But I don't know if it means very much if the end value isn't reflective of market. And so if I believe that the approach that maybe we or I have taken, they result in reasonable estimates of market value, and like I said, you can use the income approach, but if the resulting value is I would say pretty low, and there's no market evidence to support that value that you've created with your income approach. I'd say that maybe the income approach might need your income approach might need some adjustments to try to have it be more reflective of market value. So I do give some credibility or weight to market evidence in terms of market value, which might include sales per unit.
Okay, I was gonna ask another question, but I forgot what it was, so I'm gonna have
Sorry.
Geez, it was an important one. It'll probably come to me later. Okay, no further questions. Thank you for that. Mr. Newman, can you please begin your presentation?
Yes, and again, I'm going to begin to sort of where we ended off because, and I'm concerned about this. And Mr. Moretsky, your question was a very intuitive one, which is essentially what methodology is the assessor using? Where's he putting his weight? And as the morning has gone on, it becomes more and more apparent that the assessor is attempting to use what I'll call a direct comparison approach, which essentially says, I'm looking to the market. The market says these types of buildings sell for X dollars per unit, and therefore the value I've assigned is fair. But he hasn't done a direct comparison approach, and it's very dangerous, in my opinion, to do or present what is essentially a direct comparison approach without presenting all the data that's being relied upon. Again, where he seems to be sourcing this is the capitalization rate chart at page 8 of his brief, but that was never intended as a direct comparison approach. And I just think it's inappropriate to now try and support values on a direct comparison approach when that's not how they were valued. Everything has been valued on the income approach. Again, you've all been sitting as panel members for a long time. The direct comparison approach is not used very frequently, if at all, in border revision proceedings. So I think, as you asked the question, a key issue here is the property just doesn't perform the way the model thinks it should. Again, Mr. Wong, in fairness, said, when the question was asked, which is more accurate? And his answer is, well, maybe somewhere in between. Well, if it's somewhere in between, then make a somewhere in between adjustment, but don't make no adjustment to value. So at the end of the day, and a lot of this has come out already, but obviously we've got a couple of critical issues here. So if you go to my brief now, you can see that the potential income of the property is $259,858. The assessor's at $291,000. The actual revenues generated on the property, as we addressed through the assessor and the cross-examination, range from a high of 116,000 and change in 2021, 111 in 20, 106 and change in 22. And what that leads me to do ultimately, and let's jump ahead now to my page 18. So there's my spreadsheet at page 18. And you can see I've started with the 259,000 of potential income. And I end up with $123,000 in the spreadsheet of net operating income, which is about $15,000 less than the assessor. Leave the cap rate aside for the moment. And then I handwrite on the page what the actual NOIs are, the 111, the 116, the 106, and the average is $111,257. And so what I end up doing is, even though the spreadsheet generates $123,000 of net operating income, And the reason it's doing that is because by accepting the assessor's expense ratio at 50.89%, I'm ultimately overstating the revenue. That's why it's 123,000. And so I adjust that to 117,000, essentially the midpoint between the average NOI over the 3 years and what the spreadsheet would generate with an expense ratio that's too low, and accordingly will overstate the net operating income a little bit. And I attach all the financial statements, but again, we've looked at them already, so we don't have to go to them again. I think it's clear the net operating income is low. And again, Mr. Wong fairly indicates that he thinks that the more accurate income approach is somewhere in between. Well, that's kind of where I've gone, a little bit somewhere in between. But again, clearly the property is not able to generate the kind of revenue and kind of net operating income the model suggests it should by using a net operating income of $138,000. Then we come back to the capitalization rate again. And again, this one's at 5.15. So, you've had a series of capitalization rates this morning. And this is now the fifth of the properties the fourth of the properties we're dealing with. And they've ranged from 5.3 to 5.15 to 5.1 to 4.8. And this one by the assessor is at 5.15. I think that's, as I've said, I think that's too low for all the reasons I've articulated. And so ultimately, I'm asking for a value based on a net operating income of $117,000 at a 5.75 cap, turns into $2,034,000 of value. Those are my submissions.
Thank you. Mr. Wong, any questions on the applicant's presentation?
No questions.
Ms. Schultz, any questions?
No questions at this time, thank you.
Mr. Seelan, any questions?
Yes, have you inspected this location?
I have not.
Thank you. That's all. Any questions, Mr. Chair?
Okay, sorry, maybe I missed a little bit of what you were saying there. Why did you change your net operating income from 123 to 117 again?
So
Sorry.
what I did is I used rents in place, and I tracked it through with vacancy and the assessor's expense ratio, and that puts out 123,000. But then I looked at what the property was actually doing, and that's the handwritten actual NOI of 111, 116, 106. That averaged 111, 257. And the reason, because I probably should not have used the assessor's expense ratio. That probably should have been increased. But having left it there, I then adjusted it and took the midpoint between the 123 and the average of 111, 257. And so fixed the NOI at 117, and that's what I capitalized. That's what I did.
Okay, thanks. No further
Sorry,
questions?
I guess maybe a question that the panel had, or Mr. Moretsky had asked. You didn't include parking in your workup either?
I did not.
Okay. Is there any reason why you don't include that income?
But because, and this is a case where really the difference here is the vacancy. That's really the difference. Because the effective gross income was 260, and I was at 259, 858. So the difference is really the vacancy.
Okay. So sorry, that's all.
Okay. That's all the questions I have for the applicant, but I did now remember what question was I wanted to ask you, Mr. Wong. If I can
Yes.
ask that. So if you're saying that the market is is a better driver, or in this case, determining the value, like what the value per suite, then are you actually implying that the rent potential that they have right now is not being utilized by whoever is owning it or managing it?
That's
That,
what the model seems to sort of indicate, and it's indicating that probably market rents could be a bit higher than what they're charging.
why would somebody do that? Why would somebody go lower than what they should actually be getting? Just mismanagement, or what do you think?
The thing is not, I guess the not every property is operated perfectly and most efficiently. Sometimes I've seen properties where the rents are, say, $600 for a 1 bedroom and $675 for a 2 bedroom in the Osborne Village area, and it's just the owner is maybe not attuned to the market, or not that the owner's not attuned to the market. They're just used to keeping things the way they are, and they just keep doing that for an extended period of time. And so not all buildings are sort of operated perfectly or most efficiently.
Mr. Mr. Chair, I just have one clarification question for the applicant.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you. The actual value that you have now is a revised value, I assume, of 2,034,782. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Sorry, and just for clarification with regards to maybe a direct comparison, like within valuation, typically what happens is that you can take income as the primary valuation approach, but you can also use direct comparison to reconcile your value to sort of to make sure that the income approach that you've taken is resulting in an accurate estimate of value. So it's sort of a checkpoint where you're just you could use the direct comparison approach just to try to make sure that the income approach, the way you've approached the income, is resulting in a reasonable estimate of value. So it's that's pretty much that's how I've learned valuation. It's like when you try to go and value something, you can use the income approach to be the main driver of your value, but you can also use the direct comparison approach just to make sure to reconcile your income value to make sure that it's a reasonable estimate of value. So it's not like we're just sort of relying on it 100%. It's just more along the lines of it's sort of it confirms that the approach that we've taken is results in reasonable estimates of value.
Okay, anything in summation then, Mr. Wong?
No, thank you.
Mr. Newman, anything in summation?
Yes, I want to address the last comments Mr. Wong made. And in theory, I agree that appraisers will frequently, in doing a report, do an income approach and also do a direct comparison approach. But let's be crystal clear on something. What's being done here is not a direct comparison approach, and it's not the methodology that was utilized. What Mr. Wong is now trying to do is support his income-driven values by backing into something. But the problem is when an appraiser does a direct comparison approach, they'll lay out 4, 5, 6 comparables of properties they think are comparable. They'll identify all the characteristics of those properties. They'll identify, and that's all the amenities we've talked about, the number of units, the mix of units, other amenities in the building. They'll identify all of those things because frequently you need to make adjustments because buildings are not directly comparable. So that's not happening here. This is not a direct comparison approach that Mr. Wong has done, but that's how he's now attempting essentially to support Because again, the question was asked of him, how are you doing this? Are you putting more weight on what's been called market value, which expressed differently means value per door, value per unit? But that's not the methodology he's come with, and there's no ability to look at it. The other question was asked about buildings and whether the rent that's being charged here is appropriate. What I can say to you, and I've been active with Ash Management for years and years, they are a sophisticated, active manager who've been at their business for decades. They have a large stable of properties they manage. They know their business. They know how to charge rents. They know how to operate properties efficiently and properly. They're not an absentee manager who might just let things slide. None of that is happening here. They always try and maximize revenue. Thank you. That's it for me.
Okay, thank you. That will conclude the property 355 St. Anne's Road then. And let's move to the next property on our docket, number 5, which is 99 Dalhousie. This is an application for revision for the amount of the assessed value. Mr. Wong, can you please begin your presentation?
Yes, thank you. The subject property is 99 Dalhousie Drive. The file number is 24-3868. The roll number is 030-437-80500. The roll year is 2025, and the assessed value is 23,380,000 for the residential taxable portion and 369,000 for the institutional exempt portion, for a total value of 23,749,000. This is a residential apartment that's 3 stories high. It is built in 1972, and it has 192 units with 161 outdoor parking stalls. I have a recommended for the revised value, which I'll go over on page 7.
Is it 192 or 193 suites? You said 192.
Sorry, 93. Sorry, my apologies. Or actually, this one. Yeah, 193. On page 3 is a picture of the subject property with its location.
You were going to get to your recommendation.
Yeah. The my recommendation is on page 7. And the model rent appears to be a bit high compared to the actual rent. So as with one of the previous properties, I used their actual income at about 2.4 million, and applied the model expenses at 46% to get a net operating income of 1.3 million, and then capping it at 6.1%. The estimated value for the apartment is 21,768,000, and then adding the value for the exempt portion at 369,000, the total value being 22,138,000, which works out to about 112,000 per unit.
Okay, if I can just stop you for a moment there. Mr. Newman, are you accepting of that recommendation?
Not yet. I need to ask some questions.
Okay, we'll just have him carry on, and then
Yes.
with your questions. Okay.
Yes.
Carry on, please, then, Mr.
Sure.
Wong.
Again, on page 3 is a picture of the subject property with its location. And on page 4 is an interior photo of the subject property. It does indicate that the property, all the suites have been recently renovated. So on page 5 is our income valuation summary, which is the model derived values. So for the taxable portion, we have the value. We used a rate of $1,202 per unit to get a potential income of $2,741,000. Used a vacancy rate of 3.1% to get an effective gross income of $2.6 million. And we used a 46% expense ratio to get a net operating income of $1,426,000, capped at 6.1%. The estimated value is $23,380,000 and about $123,000 per unit. On page 6 are some rent comparables showing that the rents we've used are in line with what's in the market. On page 7 is the calculation of the revised value. That is on my page 1. On page 8 and 9 is information on how we derived our cap rates with some cap rate sales. And on page 11 is the income statement supplied by the owner. Yeah, my revised value, I use their actual rent income, and it seemed to be reasonable, and but I did not use the actual expenses as they appear to include capital in their repair and maintenance, and their management and administration appears inconsistent, where in 2020 it was 333,000, and in 2022 it was 179,000. So I felt that using the model expense ratio was reasonable, and the resulting value at about 112,000 per or 112,000 per unit is reasonable and fair, especially considering that all the units have been renovated. So I ask that you accept the revised value of 22,180,000 or 138,000.
Okay. Mr. Newman, any questions?
Yes.
Yeah, go
Yes.
ahead.
So towards the end, Mr. Wong, you said that your revised value uses the actual rents. And, you know, I know, for example, that in relation to the first property we did this morning, you went to the effective gross income. So when you say you're using the actual rents, what number, how do you get 2,473,000? And this is page 7 of your brief.
I think I just removed the commercial rent.
Right. Okay. Okay, I don't think that's quite it. Here's what I'm going to ask you. If you look at page 11, you see there's interest income of $34,000. Don't you think that should come out?
Yes, that would typically not be included.
Right. So here's what I'm prepared to say. if we take the 2,473,000 and take off the 34,000, $250 of interest, I get effective gross income of 2,439,455. And if I took 53.68% of that, I'd be left with net operating income of 1,309,499. And if I cap that at 6.1, I get 2,146,720. Assuming my math is correct, and we'll check that, in concept, does that make sense to you? 21,467,000. It's about $300,000 different than you are.
Yeah, I'm just sort of working it out myself.
Okay.
Can you give us the NOI again, please, that you had, Mr. Newman?
So what I did is I took his 2,473,705. I subtracted $34,250 of interest, which got me to 2,439,455. I then took 53.68% of that. In other words, I'm taking off 46.32 of expenses. And that gave me an NOI of 1,309,499.
I calculated something slightly different, but it's pretty close. I calculated, like, say if you took the total income of 2,549,905 and you subtracted the commercial rent and you subtracted the interest, that gives a net operating income of 2,445,462. And then if you apply the 46.32%, so yeah, 46.32% expense ratio. The expenses are 1,132,738, giving a net operating income of 1,312,724, and then capped at 6.1% would result in a value of 21,520,000. That's what I calculated.
Okay, I understand what you've done.
Yeah.
Because I
So
started.
would be that value would be reasonable.
Okay, so I understand, and the difference is my starting point was your 2,473,000, simply taking off the interest. You've gone back to the 2,549,000 on page 11 of the statement, and you've taken off the interest and you've taken off the commercial rent.
Yeah.
Okay. So 21,520,000, if that's the number, works from my perspective.
Well, then, yeah. So
plus the exempt.
369. Okay, now, Mr. Wong, so you're going to accept that then, Mr. Newman?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Wong, can you go through those numbers again, your EGI, NOI, and value?
Yes.
You don't have to tell us how you got there, just give us the numbers.
Sure. The EGI is 2,445,462.
Okay.
The expenses are 1,132,738.
Can you repeat that?
1,132,738. And the net operating income is 1,312,724.
Value?
The total at a 6.1 cap, the value is 21,520,000. And then when you add the exempt portion of 369,000, the total value is 21,889,000.
Okay. So, the question I had is, the exempt portion is a commercial portion? Is that what it is?
It's a daycare.
Yeah.
Daycare? Okay, so you didn't touch that then
No,
in any of these calculations?
And I don't touch it either.
So this would be your revised recommended assessment then?
correct.
So we can approach it in that fashion then. Okay, fair enough. Does anybody have any questions about that panel?
No questions, Mr. Chair.
None for me either.
And I have no questions. Okay, so we have then for 20T, 21,520,000 and 40E 369,000 for a total of 21,889,000, correct?
Correct.
That then will conclude 99 Dalhousie. We'll then move on to the next property, 88 Eric Street. This is an application for revision of the amount of the assessed value. Mr. Wong, can you please start your presentation?
Just before he gets rolling, let me mention that he's making recommendations on all three of them, and I am going to accept.
Okay. Fair enough. Yeah, thank you for that information.
Okay, I guess I'll just get things on the record and
Yeah, exactly. Do it that way.
excuse me. The subject property is 88 Eric. The file number is 24-1100. The roll number is 080-041-90000. The roll year is 2025, and the assessed value is 24,618,000. I have a recommended value for 20,496,000, which is my page 4. And this is to recognize that the model is overestimating the actual income, and so.
Okay, and Mr. Newman, you will accept that recommendation?
I will.
You carry on with the rest of your presentation on that basis, please.
Sure. Just on page 4 is the revised valuation, which where you can see at the bottom the estimated value is 20,496,000. And I guess I'm not sure if you want me to go any further than that.
Won't be necessary.
Okay.
Mr. Newman, any questions?
I have no questions.
Mr. Seelan, any questions?
No questions, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Ms. Schultz, any questions?
No questions, thank you.
And I have no questions. And we do not need to go through with your presentation then, Mr. Newman.
Thank you.
That then will conclude 88 Eric Street. Proceed then to the next property, 130 Bellevue Road.
Thank you. The subject property is 130 Bellevue Road. The file number is 24-1099. The roll number is 080-041-90500. Roll year is 2025, and the assessed value is 26,974,000. I recommend that the value be revised to 22,527,000, which if you go to my page 4 is the revised workup for the revised value.
Just so you know, we never had the original workups in your briefs, right?
No.
You're aware of that? Okay.
Yes, yes.
And Mr. Newman, you are going to accept that?
I am.
Okay. I don't think it's necessary to go through with the remainder of your presentation. So,
Okay. No,
Are-
that's good.
are there
Good by
any
me.
any questions from any of the panel?
Oh, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
No questions, thank you.
And I have no questions. Okay, so just to finalize the number then, it's 22 million. Recommended number is 22,527,000. Which was accepted by me. That will conclude item number 7, 130 Bellevue Road then. Proceed to the next property, 365 Ham Street. This is an application for revision of the amount of the assessed value. Mr. Wong may proceed with your presentation.
Okay. The file number is, or sorry, the subject property is 365 Thames Avenue. The file number is 24-1087. The roll number is 141-001-29785. The roll year is 2025, and the assessed value is 43,604,000. I recommend that the value be revised to 39,908,000, which you can refer to my page 5 for the workup.
Mr. Newman, are you accepting that recommendation?
I am.
Okay, not necessary for you to continue if you do not wish to, Mr. Wong.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, any questions from the panel?
No questions, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
No questions, thank you.
I have no questions. So the final recommended number then is 39,908,000. Which was accepted by the applicant. That then concludes this property, 365, too many dollar figures in my head, 365 Thames Street. And we have heard all of the items scheduled at this hearing, and it is now adjourned. Thank you very much, Mr. Wong and Mr. Newman.
Good morning to everyone. Best of the season to all.
Yeah.
Same to you. Thank you.
Thank
Uh,
you.
Thank you, panel members. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Secretary. Have a good day.
You all.